So today's guest was born in Breslau, Germany on August 2nd, 1925. Since the family was Jewish, his father's sporting goods store was boycotted by the Nazis. On October 1938, he and his family managed to escape to the United States just over 1 week before Kristallnacht. In 1943, he was drafted into the U.S. Army, where he served as an in the intelligence unit. So let's welcome today's guest, Colonel Frank Cohn. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we've had another conversation earlier, another time, and for me, it's very motivating and interesting to see a person of your longevity expressing your history, expressing your life in a very understandable and comprehensible manner. And what I wanted to ask you first off is, uh, what do you attribute your longevity to?
Oh dear, that's a rough one.
Well, then let's
Well,
hear it.
I guess in a way, some clean living. I never got to smoke. Alcohol, I had some alcohol, but always in moderation. And since my medications came in about 20 years ago,
Right.
I had to lay off the alcohol. So that got killed too.
Right.
And then I did do one good thing. I always had exercises, stretching exercises every day, and I don't miss that.
Right. Right.
I had one this morning, and about 20 minutes. And I think that probably had lots to do with it too, because I'm still able to walk, although on long distances I'm a little bit shaky. So I use a rollator to help me to make sure I don't fall down, because falling is the killing aspect,
Yeah.
and I've been able to avoid it so far.
Yeah. So how does it like it's interesting because, as we go through different phases of our life, you appreciate the place you're at. And then if you look back, you say to yourself, oh, I can't do this anymore. But you have to say, I appreciate where I'm at right now. Yeah.
Well, that's very true. You lose certain things as you go along, and uh, even the thought process isn't quite as sharp as it used to be. Although I'm still doing pretty well, but once
Absolutely.
in a while I lose a word. I can't think of it, and the strange part is sometimes it comes in German, and I haven't spoken German in years,
Wow. Wow.
but
Wow.
that was my first language. And whoops, there's a word that comes into my mind, and I can't even translate it until I think about it for a number of minutes, and then it does come back to mind. But
Yeah.
it's a strange process.
It's very interesting because I work with my father has Alzheimer's. He's
Oh,
And so I researched a little bit and I found out there's a certain sound to listen to, regardless of a person has that or not. It's a specific frequency that you listen to an hour a day, and it breaks any of the memory blocks out of the way. It was a study done by MIT. If you're interested, I'll send it to you. You could always listen to it. I listen to it every morning.
oh yeah, that would be interesting. Yes, of course.
I'll send that.
That's the one thing you want to avoid
Yeah, I
if you
understand. I
possibly
mean,
avoid it. And
um,
I don't think they have the methods in line yet
I
as to
know.
what to do to avoid this, and
Yeah.
head it off, or stop it at least in progression.
Yeah. And what about diet, nutrition? Did you follow a certain form of eating, or you ate whatever you liked?
Well, I cut down a little bit on salt and on sugar, but I violate that quite a bit, so I can't say that I've done it successfully.
Right.
Possibly the salt. I never add any salt to anything, but if you eat a salty soup, Campbell, for example. If you open a can of Campbell, it's a very salty soup,
Yeah,
and I
absolutely.
do have those quite a bit.
Yeah. All right. Let's get a
So,
little bit on. Let's get on to, um, I think about. I did a documentary film on my grandfather, who was a Russian soldier during World War II. He was a political officer in the ski battalion in the Battle of Moscow.
well, he probably was better off as a political officer because
Yes.
some of the Russian soldiers were really mistreated by the army. That's what we found out
Yes. Yes.
when we met the Russians. That was you didn't want to get drafted into the Russian army if you
No,
could
I know.
avoid it. Yeah,
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 but he was a ski battalion, and so I look back at his life. He when he died in 1942, and I look at your life all these years later. He was around fighting at the same time you were, and he lost his life when he was 25. And I think of all the years that other people, again like yourself, who've endured. And I wanted to ask you the question: when you returned back to Germany after you escaped after Kristallnacht and after your bar mitzvah,
yeah.
and you
During the
came
war, you mean?
right during the war, you came to America. What was the feeling like of going back to Germany? Anxiety,
Well,
fear?
actually, it was a pretty good feeling because I was a victim when I was in Germany as a young kid, and now I was in charge. And I was always in charge. When countering and talking and interrogating Germans. By the way, I never told them that I was born in Germany. I always told them that my parents were born in Germany and we spoke German at home. That's how I learned it. But I was born as an American because I never wanted to get a question of loyalty inserted into the process. So whether or not they believed in it, I couldn't care less.
Yeah,
But that's the story I gave them, and that's what I stuck to.
yeah. And what was the feeling? What was the first feeling like to say I'm opposite a German soldier who ridiculed, ostracized my family, not him per se, but the ideology of a person that represents what hated you. What did it feel like to
Yeah.
sit opposite?
Well, it became almost automatic because when you're the interrogator and the person is being interrogated, they knew who was in charge of the entire situation. It was always the interrogator, and it couldn't be taken away from the interrogator. If they tried to do that, you just cut the interrogation and and get that person into what he didn't want to do,
Right.
into a situation where there's going to be in-depth interrogation and he has to languish someplace until they're ready to talk to him and then they go back to that. I never got into the deeper interrogation. Mine were always interrogations to separate people who had more intelligence and needed further interrogation versus those who could just be put into a POW camp and cast aside because they didn't have any intelligence value. Let me give you the most dramatic example. Uh, he was a major general in the Waffen SS. That was the army that was staffed by Nazis, and he was a major general and in front of me, and he was at attention, and he saluted me, and I saluted him back, of course. And I asked him his name, and he said, August Wilhelm von Hohenzollern. Well, my German education recognized the von Hohenzollern immediately. That's the aristocracy. And when he says August Wilhelm, shortened was Auvi. This was Prince Auvi, the son of the Kaiser. So I broke off that interrogation immediately and I went back to the captain and said, I got a hot one for you.
Yeah.
And that was the last that I talked to Prince Alvi. They took him away. But, you know, here a major general at attention saluting a young Jewish kid who had to escape from Nazi Germany to get away from these people. It was very ironic,
Yeah.
but was real. That's how it worked.
Yeah. How did you have the desire to tell did you have the desire to tell them that you were Jewish? The German soldier that you interrogated, did you have the desire to throw that in?
Well, if they knew my name, they knew I was Jewish.
Right,
The
right.
name of Cohn, you can't hide that. That's a Jewish name. Uh, well, of course, we didn't use name tags during the war, so they didn't really know my name during the war, and whether or not they knew I was Jewish or not, they might have suspected it just on the basis of my appearance. But um, I never had any problem with it. Never.
Yeah, yeah. So did when you obviously there's a feeling of being the discrimination has to put some type of mark in the personality of feeling not less than, but not that you belong to the majority when you were as a child in Germany, just when you were getting bar mitzvahed. And so here you are as a soldier. Did any of that creep in to feel like they're judging you, looking at you as a Jew?
Oh, in the beginning, absolutely. When I came to the States, well, first of all, I didn't speak English. I had 2 lessons of English, and on my first day in class, the teacher wanted to get me to be acquainted with the other kids. She said, Frank, take the waste paper basket around and collect the trash. I had no idea what she was talking about, but
Right.
she looked at the window. I said, she wants me to open the window. So I opened the window, and of course, all the kids are laughing. Here's this new kid, and he's opening the window when he's told to circulate with the waste paper basket.
Right.
Well, of course, it gave me quite an incentive to start learning English, and I did that concentrating on first of all the radio. Now I never knew what they were talking about, but I got the intonations and I imitated that so that I wouldn't get that German accent. I understood that I wanted to get away from that kind of thing. And then what really helped was the movies, because in the movies you could see the plot and you could see what's going on. So you missed a few words, but you understood basically
Yes.
what was going on, and you started to learn more and more of the words that are being used. So the movie was a terrific teacher for me, and it helped me get it. But it didn't take away, even when I was pretty fluent in English, it didn't take away uh, the complex that I inherited for being a second class citizen in Germany as a young kid. So you always felt that you weren't part of the group that you were in. And it was an inferiority complex,
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
that you had. And that carried forward all the way through high school. And it even crept in when I was first drafted into the Army. I felt completely separated. And there was another incident there that made it even worse. That is, in in the reception center, when you come in, it usually takes 3 days to get you all organized before you got orders to go to basic training. Well, everybody in my group got their orders except me. So I went to the sergeant, and I still remember his name, Sergeant Chiro. He was an Indian, American Indian.
Wow.
Sergeant Chiro, I said, how come I didn't get orders? I'm the only one without orders. So he said, let me check it out. And then he came back. He said, Well, it's obvious. You're an enemy alien. I said, I'm an enemy alien. He said, yes. You were born in Germany. Germany is the enemy. You had a German passport, which is the only passport you ever had. You didn't get an American one because you never got naturalized, because I came over on a visitor's visa. Well, he said, you're going to be here until the FBI investigates you and clears you. So I thought to myself, oh my God, on the second day, I got KP. They woke me up at 4 in the morning, and I was in the kitchen till 8 o'clock at night, peeling potatoes, for example,
Wow.
which doesn't work anymore. Now you get potatoes with a peel on it. It was all a waste of time. Well, anyway,
Right, right,
uh,
right.
the it, I thought, good grief, I'll be a permanent KP here while the FBI investigates me. I said, Sergeant Sherrill, by the way, I know a little bit about the military because I was in high school ROTC, and I had one summer course of ROTC in college. And I know the close order drill. I know the terminology. I know various tactics and so forth. And Thoreau said, well, I'm glad you told me that. I'll tell you what, I'll make you an acting gadget. What's an acting gadget? He said, well, here's an armband with corporal stripes. Now, don't get the idea that you're a corporal. This is all a temporary thing. You don't get paid like a corporal. You're an acting corporal. But you're now a seasoned soldier of 4 days in the Army. And when those new recruits come in, you form them up and you march them to the theater where they see those two films that you saw on the third day. I thought to myself, well, great, because it sure as heck is better than KP. So I got the first group and I marched them off, and I saw the two films again. Uh, Why We Fight, which was a very good film showing why we were in the war.
Right.
And the second one, How to Avoid Venereal Diseases.
Wow, wow.
I saw that movie more than anybody else in the United States Army for 3 months, every day, just about.
Oh my God.
Well, anyway, after 3 months, the FBI cleared me. I went to basic training in Fort Benning, Georgia. And 3 weeks later, they took me to, without telling me what it was, they took me to Columbus, Georgia, to the Federal District Court, and I was sworn in as a U.S. citizen. Boy, was I proud of that. I congratulated myself because nobody else was there to congratulate me. It was all done one on one. And that thing did a wonder for me. It took away some of that estrangement that I had.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was willing now to say, I'm part of the group. I'm an American like everybody else. What the heck am I worrying about?
I
And
belong.
it changed completely, changed my life completely. I got
What?
away from the self-flagellation that I was
Yeah,
involved in.
absolutely. What was your mother's reaction? What was your mother's reaction of you joining the army and leaving, going back to Germany? Do you remember?
Well, uh, they knew I was going to get drafted, and I knew I was going to get drafted, and I wanted to be drafted because we had an obligation here for payback. The United States saved me. What happened was we ended up in New York. My mother and I, my father went first to try to get an affidavit so we could emigrate. He went on a visitor's visa, and he had to stay longer because the people who were his relatives, which he found, uh, they didn't have the money to guarantee that he will never become a burden to the state. That was part of the affidavit. When you get an affidavit that there
Wow.
was a depression and they didn't have the money. So he had to stay longer. And by staying longer, he avoided being met by the Gestapo that came to our door looking for him. And my mother said he was on an international business trip, and she was instructed that he was to report to the Gestapo the minute that he returned. And of course, that raised red lights in her brain. And even I knew this is a problem because there was a business acquaintance who had been told to report to Gestapo headquarters. And he went there, and a few hours later, they found him on the sidewalk in front of the headquarters where he had either jumped or been pushed out of a second class or third story window.
Wow.
So my mother immediately told my father, "Stay where you are. Don't come back. You'll get arrested." And then 3 days later, a British lady came to our door, and her name was Mrs. Griffith. And she had an official document that ordered us to provide her with a bedroom. So obviously, she was an informant for the Gestapo. And we did that, and my mother said, whatever you do, if you have something important to tell me, we got to go outside. We can't do it in the house because she's an informant.
Wow.
Anyway, a couple of weeks later, my mother said, "Let's go outside for a walk." And I knew this was serious. And she said, well, I had gone to the American consulate and got myself a visitor's visa, just like my father did before that. And it was lucky they didn't have computers. They didn't realize my father was already in country, and she was trying to get a visa as a visitor, but she obviously was trying to be a refugee, and they wouldn't have given her visa because they didn't want refugees.
Right.
Anyway, she said, then I went a day later to the consulate and bribed somebody to put you on that visa as well. That was completely out of her character, but she did it, and it was easy because I was on the passport with my mother. It was the passport for my mother with son naming me, and all they had to do was say that the visa also entailed the son.
Right.
So he said, "We're going to go tomorrow." Well, I had one more soccer game to play, and I was distracted. I helped them lose the game. But at the end, she had told me never say anything about us leaving to anybody. So I said, "See you next time." Well, of course, I knew there was not going to be a next time. And I never heard or found out anything about what happened to those kids because if their parents hadn't taken some action to get out of the country, it was pretty late in the game. It's 1938, 1 year before the war started over there. So I would think that most of the kids in my class never survived their teenage
Wow.
ages. They got probably killed in concentration camps. Well, anyway, we took a train then to Berlin, where she said goodbye to her father, my grandfather, and he died in a concentration camp uh, about a year later. And she said goodbye to her eldest sister uh, and her family, and they were able to go to Australia because two of their boys had already been to Australia, and they were able to get the rest of the family out. But she never saw them again either because we didn't have the money to go to
Yeah.
Australia. Neither did they have to come to the States. Anyway, uh, a year later, the war broke out, and I was 16. I thought, well, this wasn't going to affect me any. It didn't take too long that I realized, oh, the war is much longer than I thought, and I
Yeah.
was going to get drafted, and I was all prepared to be drafted, and my mother was prepared for me to be drafted, and we had the obligation for payback because I was saved. How we were saved, we had arrived on the 30th of uh, let's see, yeah, 30th of October, 1938 in New York. On the 9th of November, 1938 was Crystal Night, the pogrom, the action against the Jews that hit all the newspapers and whatnot, where they smashed all the remaining store windows of any Jewish inhabitant, and they burned all the synagogues and arrested all the males that they could get their hands on. And then they imposed a big fine on the Jewish community to pay for the damage that was done by the Nazis to repair whatever was damaged. Anyway, we were, of course, devastated about our relatives that were still in Germany. And but ironically, this catastrophe saved us because President Roosevelt issued an executive order that stated that nobody would be forced to return to Germany, which meant our visas were extended indefinitely and we were saved. And that's how we needed the payback. That was a long answer to you.
Yeah, no, no, it's very interesting. It's it's what's interesting is that you're an eyewitness to an event that people only can witness on in history books or on recordings like YouTube. But for me to actually sit in your presence, I'm honored to be able to hear your life because your experience is palpable and it's also hits the soul because
Well,
go ahead.
11 of our fairly close relatives, like aunts, uncles, and my grandfather and cousin, uh, 11 of them were killed because they couldn't get out. It was too late for them to get out. But the problem in Germany was very simple. Uh, it, it were salami tactics, you might say. Uh, when Hitler came into power, there were immediate repercussions. One of them was that they were demonstrating in front of our store saying, "Don't buy from Jews." And my father sold the store and so forth. And then the German Jews always said, "Well, okay, now it can't get any worse." Well, if they waited a little bit longer, it got worse. And it really got worse in 1935 when the law came out that segregated everything. We were completely segregated and second class citizens. We were still citizens, but second class. And it got worse, and now they thought it wouldn't get worse. That's it. We can live in isolation and just internally with our own group.
Right.
Well, of course, it got worse than that when they started to arrest the people um, in the Crystal Night business in 1938. That from there it really went down the drain, and then by 1938, the it came
During
through.
your childhood, certainly you have to have some fond memories of as a child. And in those memories, do you go back and did you have to bury them, or are you able to look back in some of the years prior to leaving that stand out as, oh, this was fun, this was enjoyable, or you've forgotten about it, or you try to forget about it?
Well, of course, until age 5 or 6, you hardly remember what happened, right?
Right.
You were too young. And what I remember at age, well, let's see, that was 1933. I was 5, 6, 7, 8. I was still 7 years old before I hit 8. And I used to play with German kids in the sandbox. But when Hitler came to power in January 1938, 1933, suddenly the kids that used to play with me never showed up. And I asked my mother, how come they never showed up? Well, she explained, well, it's simple. They don't like, their parents don't like Jews, so they won't let their kids play with you because you're Jewish. And this is where my inferiority complex started to be seated.
Yes.
And of course, that was the end of me playing in the sandbox. And, that I remember, and it is associated with becoming a second-class citizen right there. So the memories that I have aren't quite as favorable. The only favorable part are, for example, my soccer team. I think of that team with uh, great regret that I lost contact and really didn't know what happened to those other kids because I liked all those other kids. Uh, and that still stayed in my mind with a happy memory.
Right.
But the rest of it, my contact with Germans, it went down the drain. As a kid, uh, I I just shudder and disregard whatever happened.
Yeah, it's interesting how humans can destroy memories, but also a
Yeah.
connection towards your roots of where you were born and where you lived.
For example, we couldn't go to a restaurant anymore after 1935 because the restaurants all had signs, Jews not desired, or if they were not a high grade, Jews forbidden. Uh, so then you could only be invited to somebody's house to eat somewhere else, but the restaurants were gone. And that's the kind of stuff that sticks in your mind.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. When I wanted to go back to the interrogations. When you first interrogated people, you were first in line, as you mentioned, and then they went to other processes. They were further interrogated. So
Yeah.
were you looking for SS soldiers? And if you were, did you have to check to see if they had the O tattoo? Was that your job to do?
Well, that, of course, they couldn't deny that they were SS, as you said. They had tattoos and such. So you knew immediately they were SS. But we even disregarded the SS type of association if they didn't have intelligence value. They just went into a prisoner of war camp and well, that's where they stayed, of course, and the treatment that they received there was based on their cooperation or uncooperation, if you want to say that.
Right.
Um, but we were more interested in intelligence value than we were in the punitive. Now, if we knew he was a war criminal, that's a different story. He was earmarked as that. We uh, when we started to go into Germany, we had dossiers, uh, and the dossiers were on building targets and personality targets. The building targets were anything that was going to be of use to the force and of use in reconstructing how the army had operated. Uh, so we got a better idea of the German formulation of their war plans and whatnot. And then anything like a utility and such that we had to use in the occupation. These were all first priority targets because we wanted to secure them. And then the personality targets were the war criminals. And of course, when we met one of those people, they were automatically shoved into the detailed interrogation. We didn't bother much with them. We just indicated that they were war criminals, and that was the tag that was given to the guy to be placed into a holding cell for further interrogation.
Yeah. Did you keep an were you up to date after the war on the Nuremberg trials? Did you have an interest in any of that?
Well, of course, I followed the Nuremberg trials very closely. Now, we also, when the war ended, I the interrogative prisoner of war team that I was in was dissolved a day after the war was officially over, as was the T-Force, the big intelligence unit that was being used to go into the big cities in Germany. All that was dissolved the next day, and we got different orders, and we dispersed. We had to say goodbye to all our buddies that were with us during the war. And I went to the intelligence center in Oberursel near Frankfurt,
Yep.
and there they gave me a jeep, and I had to go to the other side of Frankfurt every day, where I met a squad of German POWs that helped me build crates and place documents into those crates to be shipped back to the States for review about the Army structure and the war criminals. And that's what I did for a whole year, waiting for my orders to go back to the States. But anyway, those were my orders, and um, that's what I did after the war until I got back to the States.
Yeah. I lived in the Frankfurt area in 1987. I wasn't a
Yeah,
soldier, but I met a German woman, was married to her, and lived in the. I don't know if you were familiar with Hanau or
yeah.
Gelnhausen.
Hanau, sure. That's not too far from
No,
Frankfurt.
not too
Yeah,
far from Oberursel, not far from the
yeah.
Frankfurt area. All right, I was going to ask you a couple more questions because I know you have to go. I was going to ask you about the
Yes.
happy. What was the happiest day of your life? Not that you can't have happy moments coming up, but up until this point, what was the happiest day of your life?
Probably the day I got married.
Oh,
And that wasn't that easy either. It takes a little bit of time to tell you.
oh,
You got enough time?
I do. Yes.
Okay. Uh, what happened was I went to a high school for boys. So, and I was an only child, and my cousins were either much older or much younger. So I had no idea how to deal with girls. I knew I had to deal with girls, but I didn't know how. And a buddy of mine who had a similar situation, he was also a refugee, and we teamed up and we went to junior high school that was on my block, uh, and because they had after school activities, and we formed a ping pong team, and we challenged a couple of girls to play with us, and we came back and did that over a number of times, and we called one ping and one pong. Now I like pong. Her name really was Paula. Anyway, I even got the nerve to ask her to go to movies with me, but the war had broken out and I was about to be drafted, and I never rode to Paula, even though we were very friendly. Why? Don't ask me. I have no idea. I I just never rode. So when I came back from the army after the war, I went back to college, and by then Paula had come up in her education to be at my level. She was in college, and we met in college again. Then we realized we were just one block away from each other, and we became more and more serious. Now, at first, I was welcomed in their home, and I was a nice Jewish boy, and she was a Jewish girl, and they were happy that we were friends. But when they found out I was serious about her and that I was going to be in the army, and the army wasn't going to keep me in New York, I suddenly became persona non grata. So we had to hide our relationship, and it got more and more difficult because we couldn't meet each other that easily. And then finally, we decided that we got to get married. We got to elope. So one fine day, I arranged, I made sure that my commanding officer in the reserve, which I was in at the time while I was going to college, that he would be in his office. But I didn't ask any other questions. And I got a couple of my friends, and one of them brought his girlfriend. So there were five of us, and we went to Judge Ringel's office. And I said, "Hello there, Judge." And he was surprised to see a group. Said, "What is it that you want to do here?" She said, I wanted you to marry us. And Judge Ringel got quiet. And then he said, Frank, I'm sorry, but I'm a magistrate, not a real judge. And as a magistrate, I don't have the authority to marry you. I said, how did I get involved in this? And we went to the cafeteria to have a meal, which was going to be our after marriage meal, but it wasn't. It was before marriage.
Right.
Anyway, Paula was ready to go home. I said, no, 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 no. Let's see if we can do something else. So I got in the phone booth and went down the list of some rabbis, and a couple of them declined, but one of them in Queens said, "Yeah, I'll marry you." So off we went to the subway with the five of us to Queens, and sure enough, the rabbi, after I gave him the $2 or whatever it was, and he wrote a certificate, and we were married.
Wow.
And we thought, well, now everything is solved. But it wasn't, because there was a housing shortage and we didn't have a place to go to. As a matter of fact, we had to go back home. And we weren't going to tell anybody until we had a place to live. And it took me 2 weeks before I finally found a place, which was pretty miserable in this way. But it was at least a place. But the day that I was married was the happiest day in my life, even though I couldn't tell anybody about it. Anyway, once we got the apartment, we each went back home. I told my mother. My mother was sad that she wasn't at the wedding, but she said, "Well, you're invited to come eat with us tonight." And then Paula's mother was furious, and she was absolutely out of her mind for 24 hours. And 24 hours later, she came to our new home, and everything was forgiven. And we lived happily ever after for 72 years until
Wow.
she died about 3 years ago.
Oh, okay. What was Paula? Her name was
But
Paula.
anyway, the day I was married was the happiest day of my life.
Beautiful. Okay, so that was the happiest day. What was the most, I don't want to use saddest day. Could we use saddest day? What was the most
Well,
tragic day?
of course, there's a number of them. When your father died, my father died 1 week after I returned from the war from a heart attack. And then when my mother died a few years later, that was another very sad day. And
Yeah.
certainly, maybe the saddest day was when my wife died 3 years ago. But it's hard to say what
Yeah,
was.
yeah. But it's interesting. I do a lot of interviews with people who have what are known as near-death experiences. I interview doctors like Raymond Moody, who wrote a book, Life After Life. And like,
Oh
what
yeah,
happens to the soul after we pass away? Where do we go? What takes place? And many of the people they tell about they report back the similar stories of what they've experienced and being called to the afterlife, being called by their relatives, come, it's time to come. And some people reject it, not time yet. Um, what do you
yeah.
ever think about the longevity? Like what happens in heaven? What is your perception?
So I'm afraid I'm an unbeliever that
Okay,
way.
all
I
right.
think once you die, that's it. It's
Okay.
all over.
Yeah,
You're
no,
not
it's
going to meet anybody that you used to know
well,
when you up
I'm
in
gonna give
heaven.
you some insight to my experience. Because as I said, I interview a lot of people, and a lot of people have these experiences where, for example, they've written numerous books on this subject. And so when they pass on, like you said, I don't believe in this. I don't believe in this. I don't believe in this. What happened was this famous author that I've interviewed said, when my father passed away at his deathbed, he goes, "I hope what you told me is true." Sure enough,
Yeah.
the man saw a psychic came to him one day and said, your father wants to tell you something out of the blue. He said, "I want to tell you, your father comes to me to tell you something that whatever you told him before he passed away, he said is true." He goes, "Wherever you said I'm going and what I will see, all came true." And this is the second, that was the two people that had told me that during an interview. So we go on. Our soul lives. And I know it.
Well,
Yeah.
I would never argue with anybody
Yeah, no.
about their beliefs. I think everybody has the right
Yes,
to
yes,
put their
yes.
own, and I'm not one to
Yeah, I
uh,
understand that.
counter what they think. But I do think by myself and my own thinking is it's finished. Yeah.
Yeah, the physical body. It's interesting to subjects. I'm interested in that subject. Okay. So as you reflect back, where do you see society going? Where do you see us going in?
You mean right now?
Yeah, right now.
Well, it's a very difficult time, I think.
Yeah,
You know, after World War II, there was a long period of well, there might have been some anti-Semitism, but if there was, it was all hidden underneath. It was not overt. But lately, the overtness has come back, and you have overt anti-Semitism. Now, uh, there are very similarities of how it was before Hitler came to power in Germany as to what we're having here today, where there are lots of people who express their antipathy against the Jews, against Israel, and you could tell that they're anti-Semites. And once you have a really confirmed anti-Semite, there's nothing you can do with them. You're not going to convince them to stop that because the hate is ingrained. But you just hope that he's not going to be infectious and get that hate spread out. And it's particularly important that the hate doesn't go to the legislative body because that's where we got the killing coming in. When Hitler came to power, politically power in the government, that's when this whole thing went down the drain. Now we already have some people in the government who are anti-Semites. You could tell that just on the basis of what they were saying. Hopefully, that will stay as a small group because, as I said, those people you're never going to convince to stop being anti-Semites. They're going to stay that way, and all you can do is tell your people these are anti-Semites. Don't vote for them because you don't want that government to become
right, right.
anti-Semitic. So I do have some great concerns about the future that I hope we can hold the line and don't repeat history uh, as it sometimes gets repeated.
Yeah,
That
I
is my
understand that.
concern. Now, I won't be alive that long to find out, but certainly my daughter will be, and oh, we have to
Yeah,
worry about the next generation. And I worry about the next generation that this thing will not mushroom any further, that we can contain it and it doesn't get infectious and down the drain.
yeah. I believe yesterday was the Holocaust Remembrance Day. Um,
Yeah. Hate is awfully infectious.
yeah.
It's
Well,
amazing
why? Let me
how
ask you.
many people like to get to hate some group. Now, hating an individual, that's a different story. You can dislike an
Right,
individual,
right.
regardless of what he is or who he is, but not as a group. You should never hate a group. Jews should not hate as a group Muslims, even though many Muslims are anti-Semitic. If you have to take the person and deal with the person. And you can't assume that just because he's Muslim, he's an anti-Semite. He he might be very broad-minded and not be one. So you have to take a person as he is or she is and evaluate him on a personal basis. And that's what's important to
Yeah.
do. Never hate groups. Uh, no group should be hated.
So let me ask you, how does that work now? Be it that you suffered under the Nazi ideology as a German race, do you still have hostility towards the German people it's themselves? Were you able to distinguish between Nazis or Germans, or is it difficult to do that? Be it that you've just said what you said.
Well, I had gotten three more tours in Germany as an officer after the war,
Right.
and spoken, being able to speak German was a big advantage. And of course, I was in the military police, so I was dealing with people in the police field, and many of them in the police field used to be Nazis before
Right.
war was over. So I was dealing with Nazis, uh, and if I really knew everything about their background, I probably would never associate with them. But officially, I had to associate with them, and I always thought that I must treat people respectfully and never become like them. I was not going to take my revenge. That wasn't my role. My role was the official uh, working relationships. And the Germans loved me. Of course, they knew I was Jewish with my name Cohn. So they loved to work with me because I could speak their language. And but again, I never admitted to them that I was born in Germany, as I told them. But we had a very fine relationship, and I knew some of them had to have been big Nazis, but they weren't war criminals per se. They were never on our dossier list. Uh, so I took one person at a time, and as long as they worked with me, and there wasn't a single one who didn't work. Come to think of it, so my
Yeah, yeah.
relationship was officially very good. Now, socially, I didn't mix with these people. There were some Germans we mixed with, but these were non-political people. They were Germans, and they had no role in politics, and we accepted them socially as well.
Yeah.
The officials, uh, well, there were some functions that you had to go through. There were official functions, but that was different. That was not a social function. If they were social functions, I did not associate with them.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was in Germany, my ex-wife's uncle was in the SS. He was in the Waffen SS.
Yeah,
And one day, you talk about humanity and looking at individuals as opposed to looking at people as a whole, because you really can't. You can't see the whole race inside one individual, because your human nature is to be able to communicate one on one and see the soul of that person. And so when I went over to his house, he used to drink a lot. So when he drank, he fell off the chair. So they needed somebody to pick him up and put him on the chair. And I didn't know what his ranking in the army was. One day he falls off the chair, and they asked me if I can go over to pick him up and put him back on the chair. So I'm 21 years old. I'm Jewish. He doesn't know my identity. But I go over and I pick him off the chair, and he says to me, Adam. I spoke German. I said, "Na, was ist es?" He goes, go open up the drawer in the cabinet. So he gets out a bottle of cognac, and he says he wants to have a drink with me. So we have a drink together. And after maybe a few minutes, he says, Adam, go in my drawer and pull out those books, those papers. So I go in the drawer and I pull out the papers, and he says, I give it to him, and he shows me his arm. He goes, you see my tattoo? So I saw the tattoo. Then he shows me his SS papers that he was in the Waffen SS, and
Yeah,
it was very interesting to see how people were sheltered and hidden and back into society, working in nice jobs, German companies, and cushioned with their past. So I got to see firsthand something that when I ask you the questions, to see somebody like yourself who interrogated these people, and then I saw the human side of it. It's very easy to have hostility, but then you understand that this person had a life, whatever the reason, whatever they went through, good or bad.
yeah,
It was very interesting to me, and I tried to understand it all. And then there was another one who was in the tank division and had his teeth knocked out by the American soldiers. So he told me, he explained to me, here I am, this guy sitting on their porch, 21 years old. He has his
yeah,
belt buckle from the war, 1987 still. He's wearing it. You know, he knocked out the swastika, and he said, "Ah, what a terrible it was such a stupid war." But nobody knew what people were thinking. He didn't know if they had the hostility. He put a picture of me up on his wall. He, of me. Just he admired me for coming there. I guess maybe his own guilt that he experienced of what they went through, what they did to the Jews in the town. And I lived in a small town in 1987 where the tombstones were still knocked over from Crystal Night from 1938. And I would walk through the cemetery and I'd look at the stones. And one German man screams through the gates of the cemetery and says, "Was machen Sie da?" And I
yeah.
said, "Ich bin Jüdisch." I said,
Mhm.
I wanted to look at the names. I'm telling him I'm looking at the names of the graves. He says, Kommen Sie here." I go to him. He says, my wife was Jewish. I was in the army. They took her to Theresienstadt away from me. He said, "Please
Mhm.
come to my house. Let's have a Sabbath dinner together." Him and I.
Mhm.
I went back to his house. Had noodles and soup, and he told me the story. He had a Metzger, the butcher shop, and then I ate with him. We lit candles, and then, interestingly enough, I met his son 15 years later, who was in his 80s. Who I asked, I went to Germany and I saw the son, who was a doctor in Manhattan. Anyway, long story short, you get to see the humanity within the suffering, within the struggles of life, that we all
Yeah.
suffer. Some people are on top, some people are on the bottom, and then it maybe switches, maybe doesn't.
You, they had this, when the war ended, they had a denazification uh, program all laid out where each Nazi would be considered, and those who needed to be punished, they were going to be punished. But those who didn't do anything more than obey orders and didn't get involved in killing, that they were going to be okay. Well, that denazification program went right down the drain because we were started to become more conscious about our relationship with the Soviets, and
Right.
the question of anti-communism became a much bigger program than the denazification, and the Nazification was just completely forgotten, except for the real war criminals. All of these others, the small Nazis got away with murder.
Yeah.
And I mean murder. They may have been involved in murder, but it was not as the instigator of it, but just as the uh, low common denominator where they had to uh, execute the desires of the superiors. All
Yeah.
those people got away with murder. Uh, well, you know,
Yeah.
uh, sure, it's justice didn't prevail, but c'est la vie. There's nothing
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
do.
I don't know if you were familiar with Project Paperclip when the Nazis were sent to Huntsville, Alabama, and after the war, Werner von
Oh,
Braun
yes.
from
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, he was typical, right? He was typical. I mean, he was an agent of the war who was pretty significant. and he got away with murder because he was so much more useful in his role on our side of the ledger, and everything else was forgiven.
Yeah,
Right?
that must have been
How it
that's
went.
the
Yeah.
yeah, everything was shifted towards away from Nazism to
That was
communism.
funny, you know. As a matter of fact, I was stationed in Heidelberg, and there was a doctor, and he approached me and said, "Oh, we're going to have a meal with Werner von Braun. Would you like to join us?" I said, "Thank you, but no thank you. I don't want to have anything to do with this man." But he was accepted socially
Yeah,
by the
yeah.
Americans. Yeah. Well, it was nice talking to you, Ed.
Yeah, I enjoy it. Okay, so God bless and hopefully have a beautiful time with your daughter.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye.